What's up, people? Today I want to talk to you about this idea of the quote unquote progressive stack, which is a kind of obscure lefty activist practice that has recently gotten a lot of attention in more mainstream circles because of this university lecturer who has been using it in the classroom. So I've seen a lot of people who I think are just genuinely baffled as to what the progressive stack even is. Um, and then that filters into a lot of confusion in sort of the debates around it. So the first purpose of this video is simply to explain what the progressive stack is. Someone actually with personal experience using it in activist settings. And the second purpose is to just share my thoughts about what I think is the most reasonable way of thinking about the importation of this practice into the university classroom. To foreshadow, I think it's totally asinine and completely indefensible in a university classroom. However, I actually do think that it makes some sense and is rather defensible in social movement settings. Okay, so I'll explain why kind of point by point. But first, just what is progressive stack? Progressive stack refers to the practice of collecting the list of names of people who are interested in speaking or contributing to a collective deliberation. Collecting those names on paper, and then sort of rearranging them or ordering them in a way that reflects a progressive intention, let's say, of putting historically marginalized groups closer to the front and more historically dominant groups more towards the end. And there are different ways that it's implemented. It's usually a kind of informal thing where the person who is taking stack, we call it, has to kind of use their judgment to sort of estimate whether a particular person kind of belongs to a more dominant group or a less dominant group. So the idea or the rationale behind it is that, and I think it's quite reasonable in a limited sense, is that some people are far more likely to be confident speaking than others. And, anyone who's been in a kind of mass movement situation, such as something like Occupy Wall Street, you do learn quite quickly, in fact, that whenever you have a collective liberation, there is going to be like a relatively small number of young white men, for instance, who just got out of university and are very confident, very comfortable speaking, have lots of ideas, and are very energetic to share those ideas. And that's a beautiful thing. That's fine. But they will be far more likely to speak up in collective conversations or deliberations than people with less experience, less confidence. And that lack of experience or lack of confidence is correlated, in fact, with things like race and gender. Okay, so the reason why it makes sense to have a progressive stack in an activist setting or kind of social movement setting is because the goals and the constraints are very different than in something like a university classroom. And so one of those goals, or unique characteristics of an activist situation that makes progressive stack actually kind of sensible, is the fact that you're trying to do a particular thing together. You have a certain common goal, and you have to kind of negotiate how to get there with a large and very diverse group of people. So that's very different than in a university classroom where you're not trying to do anything per se other than find the truth and share the truth together. That's its own sort of goal, of course, but you're not trying to create a community where everyone can kind of live or feel equally belonging or something like that. That's simply not the goal of the university classroom as it is in a kind of protest camp or something like that. The only goal of the university classroom is to seek the truth, and that should make people quite uncomfortable. It should be difficult. In a university classroom, the idea of trying to make it equally reflect the interests or preferences or wishes of all people in a kind of politically negotiated way, you actually don't want that in a university classroom, but you do want it in a collective activist setting where that is actually the goal, to try to make that. Okay, so that's one reason, because an activist kind of context is often about trying to facilitate a radical direct democracy. And in such cases, you really do need to make everyone feel equally belonging, and you want to achieve that. And also, you need everyone's input. So that's the first reason why progressive stack kind of makes sense in an activist context. And a second reason is that in an activist context, such as a protest camp or a kind of social movement or whatever, there's way more diversity than there is in a university classroom. So in a university classroom, there are already pretty strict selection criteria. All of the people in a university classroom have met certain criteria for being able to think well, being able to write well, and also they've all paid to some degree. And so in a when you're meeting a bunch of people in the streets to try and protest the government, or even more radically create some sort of like fundamentally new way of being together or something like that, well, you don't have those selection criteria to ensure that the group is relatively well selected in terms of intelligence and things like that. Those things are way more variable. So if the goal is to actually create radically democratic situations or communities, then it's all the more important that you do have some technologies for making sure that the super smart, super well bred, super let's just say dominant characteristics, the most powerful kind of personal individual characteristics that are highly unequally distributed in society, you do need some way to make sure that they don't sort of control everything. Because the technocratic kind of capitalists among you out there might think, oh well, that might be a good thing, just let them run the show, everyone will benefit from that. But actually that sucks, and it's not the kind of radically empowering, liberating, collective type of community that you're really trying to build when you're trying to build radical democracy. It can be super alienating and actually tends to reproduce all of the problems of kind of the status quo society that we often come together to try to figure our way out of. So that's the other reason why progressive stack makes sense. Basically, there's way more radical diversity, and you do need to come up with some ways to not let that run roughshod over everything. That obviously doesn't apply as much in the university, so that's another reason why the transfer over to university classrooms doesn't make so much sense. And finally, the other thing to keep in mind is that in activist situations or social movement settings, there are often really difficult time constraints. So you often have so many things that you have to discuss as a group, so many sort of agenda items that you have to get through just to sort of reproduce the everyday life of a community or a camp or an organization, and you only have so much time, right? But you often have so many people, like sometimes very large numbers of people. And Occupy Wall Street, we would have deliberations where it was like 100 or more people in a circle in a street trying to figure out how to make a decision together. What that means is those time constraints mean that there is a real risk that some people will not be able to say what they want to say about something that they have an equal right to contribute to. That just simply doesn't apply in the university classroom, where you have a relatively small number of people. Even large classrooms, much smaller than a kind of chaotic protest situation. You have a small number of people, and you have pretty ample time in regular allotments over the whole course of a semester. I mean, I have never in my entire, relatively short, but not too short experience teaching, I've never in my life encountered a situation where I had a student who wanted to express something in my class, but wasn't able to due to time constraints throughout the whole semester. I mean, that just doesn't happen. In fact, most lecturers have the opposite problem, which is, sometimes it's hard to get them to speak at all. So there's no real reason, to be honest, there's no real reason to even have a stack in a university setting, to have an actual paper list to keep track of the people who want to speak and the order in which they're going to speak or be allowed to speak. There's no need to do that because you don't have that many people, and you don't have so many hands shooting up in a chaotic situation. So there's hardly any reason to even have a stack, but there's even less of a reason to have a progressive stack where you're rearranging the order to reflect kind of progressive goals, simply because in almost any university classroom, anyone who wants to speak can and will get an opportunity to speak. So all of these differences between the activist situation and the university classroom situation, to me, suggest pretty clearly that importing this practice or technology into the university classroom basically makes no sense and is quite indefensible and is actually actively harmful to the real goals of the university classroom, which is basically to seek the truth as radically as possible with the group of people that you're in the classroom with. Bringing in these sorts of technologies and bringing in these other types of priorities that are fit for a completely different context actually tends to be at odds with what you're trying to do in the university classroom, I think.